Welcome to the panel on corporate sustainability. My name is Tony Talbott. I teach in political science and human rights here at the University of Dayton. I work within the Human Rights Center. I'm the director of our anti-human trafficking initiatives and work a lot locally and nationally on sex trafficking and labor trafficking issues, including supply chains. Before I introduce our distinguished panel, I want to very briefly introduce the topic that we're going to be talking about today. And it's a very interesting topic. The topic of the panel is corporate sustainability. And one of our first tasks, of course, is to try to figure out what the heck is meant by corporate sustainability. Because we're all for sustaining corporations, I think, that's what the whole point is, right? No, so a lot of us haven't heard of corporate sustainability, but we've heard of corporate social responsibility. We've heard of corporate accountability, even the terms corporate citizenship. But this corporate sustainability is becoming an increasingly used term. And so to try to figure it out, I did probably what I recommend everybody should do. I went to Wikipedia and I looked it up. And so very briefly quoting Wikipedia, corporate sustainability is a business approach that creates long-term consumer and employee value by creating a green strategy aimed at the natural environment and taking into consideration every dimension of how a business operates in the social, cultural, and economic environment. It formulates strategies to build a company that fosters longevity through transparency and proper employee development. It's an evolution on more traditional understandings of ethical corporate practices like corporate social responsibility, CSR. But unlike these that focus on added-on policies, corporate sustainability describes business practices centered around social and environmental considerations. So it attempts to integrate social justice, integrate the environment and considerations for them within the actual, the center of the corporation and the corporate mindset. Got to quote the tagline of the UN Global Compact, which works with business to transform our world. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? Aiming to create a sustainable and inclusive global economy that delivers lasting benefits to all people, communities, and markets. So these concepts that we're talking about, well, when look at the Agenda 2030, the Agenda for Sustainable Development, it repeatedly calls for partnership with the private sector, though it doesn't very clearly yet articulate what that partnership needs to look like. But it's definitely within the documents, within the declaration. But these concepts, corporate sustainability, CSR, corporate accountability, corporate citizenship, whatever, that's what we're going to be looking at. But more broadly, I think for our panel, we'll be looking at how we can promote and ensure socially responsible corporate practices and policies. And that's our main focus today. So I'm going to introduce our panel and see why we're going to be sitting around listening to them today, because I think they have a lot to say on this issue. I'll start on the far end with Katie. Katherine Gallagher is senior staff attorney at the Center for Constitutional Rights. That was a Freudian slip, maybe, wasn't it?
We'll see.
She works on universal jurisdiction cases involving the U.S. and foreign officials and torture and other war crimes, and cases involving private military corporations and torture at Abu Ghraib. Her major cases have dealt with U.S. torture accountability, seeking accountability for crimes against humanity of sexual violence by clergy and cover-up. She is the vice president on the international board of the International Federation for Human Rights and a member of the editorial committee of the Journal for International Criminal Justice. Her expertise includes corporate human rights abuses. And prior to coming to the Center for Constitutional Rights, Katie worked at the United Nations, or worked with the United Nations, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and the ICC, the International Criminal Court. She's written many important pieces, including articles in major media outlets, published in legal and academic journals, and has appeared on numerous news outlets. David Schilling, in the middle, is the Senior Program Director of Human Rights and Resources of the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility and has been on their staff for more than 20 years. So I should have said eternity with you instead. Yeah.
20 years.
That's fantastic. He's worked with the ICCR members and allies to engage corporations, cross-sectoral and multi-stakeholder initiatives on human rights in corporate operations and global supply chains. He has participated in delegations to a number of countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, visiting factories, meeting with workers and NGOs. For the past 10 years, he's provided staff leadership for ICCR's programmatic initiatives to counter human trafficking and modern-day slavery in the US and globally. He's co-authored numerous publications dealing with social sustainability, effective supply chain accountability, and business and human rights. He's currently chair of the advisory board of the Global Social Compliance Program, a member of the International Advisory Network of the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, RFK Center Compass Education Advisory Committee, UNICEF CSR Advisory Group, and I can keep going. He's formerly worked with the Institute for Human Rights in Business, Independent Monitoring Working Group, President Clinton's Anti-Sweatshop Task Force, and more. He's also a United Methodist minister.
Yes. Oh, excuse me.
Yes. And worked closely. This is interesting because we were talking about the Coalition of Immokalee Workers earlier, and I always call them the modern equivalent of United Farm Workers. And you work closely with Cesar Chavez to help build support within the religious community for the farm workers' struggle, for justice, and much more. This is Arvind Ganesan. He's the director of Human Rights Watch Business and Human Rights Division. He leads the organization's work to expose human rights abuses linked to business and other economic activity, hold institutions accountable, and develop standards for to prevent future abuses. His work has included research and advocacy on a wide range of issues, including the extractive industries, public and private security providers, international financial institutions, freedom of expression and information through the internet, labor rights, supply chain monitoring, due diligence regimes, corruption, sanctions, predatory practices against the poor. His work has covered countries across Africa, Asia, and the US. His recent research is focused on predatory lending practices and governance issues on Native American reservations in the United States. He's written numerous reports, op-eds, and other articles, and is widely cited by the media. He has also worked to develop industry standards to ensure companies and other institutions respect human rights. He's a founder of the Voluntary Principles on Security and Human Rights and the Global Network Initiative. He's helped develop standards for international financial institutions, such as the World Bank, regularly engages governments in efforts to develop mandatory rules or strengthen existing standards, such as the Kimberley process. He serves on several boards and is, once again, very active. I just don't want to spend the whole time going over all of the things that he's done. He also worked as a medical researcher before joining Human Rights Watch. So we've got a quite experienced and varied panel, and what I'd like to start out with, we're hopefully going to keep this very open, very conversational, very informal, but I want to give each of the panelists 5 to 7 minutes, starting, because we should start with Arvind. You were the last one to get here today, so we'll start with you and work backwards, to briefly talk about your work as it relates to promoting socially responsible corporate practices or policies.
Sure. Well, thank you, everybody, and thanks to the university for inviting us all today to talk about all this, and thanks to all of you for coming here on a Saturday. Our work at Human Rights Watch was really, and still is, premised on a couple of key concepts. And the first and most important one, and I think it touches on what everybody does, is that institutions like companies or governments don't change of their own volition. They are not operating out of enlightened self-interest. What the role of groups like Human Rights Watch is, and others is to create a public expectation that conduct should be different. And so in our work, because we're a research organization first and foremost, what we've tried to do is be one of the organizations that does in-depth field research on what companies or other actors are doing. So that's why we investigate the security arrangements of oil companies in places like Colombia or India or elsewhere. We'll look at corruption in relation to the oil sector in Angola or Equatorial Guinea or otherwise. We'll look at how the private probation industry in the South and in other parts of the country is really creating extortionate circumstances for the poor in those places. And what we believe is that by doing in-depth, accurate, and objective research, we can then go to those institutions to change their practices, and more importantly, over the long term, to create new standards or help develop new standards that prevent these things from happening in the future and hopefully hold people accountable over time. And I think for us, that's been an effective way of doing things because at our heart, we can do research. And what I've seen over the last 15 or so years now, when all of this work started, and when everybody on this panel and many others started, is we've gone from a place where no company and most governments didn't really think companies had human rights responsibilities to a discussion about what does it mean to put those responsibilities into practice. And that almost fundamentally is to the credit of civil society. That is not because companies woke up one morning and decided to be responsible or sustainable. It's not because governments decided they needed to regulate industry differently. It's because people around the world started pointing out what was going wrong. And so it's an evolutionary process that never stops. And for us, we hope to be one of the organizations that can do that kind of research anywhere, at any time, on any issue. So we'll leave it at that. Wow.
Excellent.
Did you say 50 to 75 minutes?
Yes.
The Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility was founded in 1971. And it really came out of this understanding that faith communities, through their pension investment programs, own shares in a whole range of companies. They also had social, environmental, human rights statements, whether it's Catholic social teaching, whether it's my own United Methodist social principles, all of which had hugely progressive positions around human rights, around war and peace, around a range of environmental issues, and around particularly focus on those made vulnerable by systems. So when you look at a company where many of our original members owned shares that was making napalm, that was being dropped on villages in Vietnam, it raised the question, okay, don't we have human rights responsibilities as investors? So the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility started not very interfaith. It started with the National Council of Churches, United Church of Christ, and then Episcopal Church, et cetera. Then added in a couple years later, a lot of Catholic orders, women religious, dioceses, then Jewish pension funds, and it only has been more recently that Muslim asset management firms have joined ICCR. But I think the sort of the genius of the coalition, which now has about 300 institutions, including some big public pension funds as well as asset management firms in different parts of the world, but mostly US, has been to work together to try to really impact company behavior as share owners. So, we're a religious nonprofit, and yet we recognize that there is some leverage there. And if that leverage is utilized in tandem with the kind of social movements that you described to put issues on the agenda, then we are really trying to make that kind of contribution with one foot in the sort of the NGO community and then one foot in the company, and using shareholder resolutions that get filed, that come to annual shareholder meetings. The first one filed by the Episcopal Church and some other ICCR members in 1971 at the behest of our partners in South Africa, the South African Council of Churches. And at that point, Desmond Tutu was the executive secretary. He said, ICCR, you need to get US companies to withdraw from South Africa. And it took, a major, 20 years. General Motors was the first to get that, and they looked at it, and it was essentially, what's this doing here? That wouldn't happen now. But it took them 16 years to withdraw, and it was really the youth of Soweto. It was a whole range of international developments in terms of sanctions, et cetera. But the role that we played as faith-based investors was to utilize that share-owner relationship to address a human rights, egregious human rights violation. So we've worked historically then on South Africa on marketing of infant formula to very inappropriate, in very many inappropriate ways in developing countries. Sweatshop issues, food issues, water issues, issues related to the financial sector in terms of engagements with banks. But I think of a couple of ways that we've evolved. One, I mean, we still have that company by company. So you want to get a company to adopt a human rights policy, comprehensive, transparent, verifiable human rights policy that covers all their operations. So that's one piece where a resolution can matter, and then active engagement, with a company. And more recently, we've been focusing on the issues related to particularly migrant workers, but many casual temporary workers. And that's one of the issues we can talk about in terms of the social, sustainable development goals as to the patterns that are taking place in terms of migrant workers, the numbers, the desperation, the pitfalls in terms of what happens to workers when they are really desperate and need to pay excessive fees to get a job when they should never, ever have to pay a fee. That's the employer's responsibility, but is a mechanism into forced labor, slavery. So recently, we've been trying to get companies to adopt policies around prohibiting any of their supply chain suppliers to require fees. And if workers have paid fees when they get to the farm or factory, that the supplier reimburses them, that personal papers, passports are not taken, which then really make freedom of movement almost impossible for workers, and then a written contract at the point of recruitment so that it's very clear what workers are, their responsibilities and their rights under that before they get, off to this, job in another country or within their own country. So I think there's continual work to get policies involved and then look at implementation steps, working with a range of non-governmental organizations. Right now, a lot in Thailand. It's the tip of the iceberg, but I think sometimes it helps to really zero in on a particular sector, seafood, and the Guardian Solidarity Center from the AFL-CIO did reports way back in 2008. Phil is in Thailand, has done a lot of work, Robertson from HRW, and we had one of our staff person there on the border interviewing workers as they came from Burma into Thailand, and all the mechanisms where they were being forced into slavery. And they could end up on a pineapple farm or in a shrimp farm, or finally on board a ship where the conditions are absolutely unbelievable. So I think it's really, ICCR continues to raise issues that are systemic, but also wants to see tangible steps taken, recognizing that companies operate in a venue where much more is needed than our work and civil society's work, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But for me, 20 years working with some amazing people from the religious community who have this relentless persistence in doing their homework on the issue and connected to communities through their faith orders or through NGO networks that are so critical in bringing the issues to life, and make the companies do not just a statement on their website, but to move that down their supply chain. And some of these companies, as you know, it's a whole swatch of the economy if you look at all the tens of thousands of suppliers. So it's a huge challenge, but I feel like partly it's the faith motivation of many, or those members that are not faith groups have this strong sense of moral compass. And I think what Arvind said is accurate. It's not just easily to convert, right? But we can talk a little bit more about that, about the assumptions around the sustainable development goals and the role companies would, should, could play. But I think our role has been face-to-face dialogue, 20 years, maybe 30 years. You continue to chip away, and you link yourself to movements like in South Africa or the Coalition of Immokalee Workers to really try to get companies to sign on to real, tangible, binding agreements.
Thank you. And first, I want to really start with a thank you to everyone who's organized the conference for inviting me. And it's been really invigorating and inspiring to be in a community that I'm not often in, and that's academics in more undergrad or graduate programs. I'm either with activists on the ground or in legal circles at law school, so it's really been very heartening to see and be reminded how broad the human rights community is, so thank you for that. I'm a staff attorney at the Center for Constitutional Rights, which is a legal and educational organization in New York. And I personally come at this issue more from a corporate accountability angle. Back in 1995 and 96, we filed the first 2 cases against multinational corporations for egregious human rights violations in US courts. One was a case against Shell for the execution of Ken Saro-Wiwa and others, and human rights violations against the Ogoni people in Nigeria. And the other was the Unical case in dealing with forced labor, forced mass rapes, just a range of human rights violations in the context of laying a gas pipeline in Burma. And over the 20 years that we've been doing corporate litigation work, meaning that we sue corporations for violations of human rights, we've approached our work very much as was just described, that the faith-based communities do, and that's in tandem with movements. So we don't start by saying, oh, wait, where is a company doing something bad? Let's go sue them. But more, where are there impacted communities who have tried, whether through campaigns or through protests or through community-based human rights impact assessments that haven't gotten the results that they need, and they've reached a tipping point where they feel that litigation needs to be added to the toolbox to get real corporate respect for their human rights. And so it particularly in the last 10 years with the Ruggie process and now with the guiding principles, we've been most focused on the third pillar, the so-called third pillar, the right to remedy, and very concerned with the lack of progress on this particular pillar. There are still huge roadblocks for those who've been impacted negatively by corporations to seek some kind of accountability, whether here in the United States, where we've seen some negative decisions, including out of the US Supreme Court in 2013, making it more difficult for victims who've experienced violations outside the US to sue here in US courts, but also in other countries where it may not be only litigation that's the roadblock, but the real criminalization of human rights defenders, attacks on protesters, and just a real increasingly violent response to those who are advocating for their own human rights and their community's human rights. So we see the right to a remedy not only because there should be a remedy or some form of redress when you've lost family members who've been killed, who've been seriously injured, where your water supply has been poisoned, where you've been forced off your land, that there should be some kind of compensation for that. But we also see the right to a remedy as a way to try and stop some of the egregious conduct. Because until corporations feel that it's not only a question of being voluntary and nice about respecting human rights, but that they will be held to account when they don't, that they actually will stop some of the most serious abuses. I'm also here slightly with a second hat, and that's, as Tony mentioned, I'm on the board of the International Federation for Human Rights, FIDH, and CCR, my normal day job, is a member of FIDH. So for the last 5 years, as a board member, I've been working very closely with the business and human rights team there. And through FIDH's 178 member leagues around the world, have really been privileged to hear about some of the struggles that impacted communities are facing and participate in dialogue and discussions and strategy about how to better protect their own rights. So whether that's through reports that FIDH does, or litigation, or engagement at the international level, whether, again, with the Ruggie process, with the working group, or now with the new treaty process, have been trying to bridge the gap between not only the legal framework, but also the legal community and those on the ground who are, again, most impacted by corporate violations. So,
would anyone like to respond to anything anyone else said before we move on? No, not yet. Excellent. I agree. I concur wholeheartedly. Yeah, that was excellent. What I'd like to move into is then really the first question, sort of guiding discussion question that we have. Does the agenda for sustainable development give sufficient attention to the role of the private sector in ensuring prosperity and achieving the agenda's goals in terms of poverty reduction and an inclusive society? We could continue the way.
I mean, in looking at the goals, it's obvious that the private sector is intimately involved in achieving the goals, either as employers or the entities that can contribute to climate change or help solve these problems. But I don't get the sense, and particularly the UN has really thought through what that actually means for the private sector. And I kind of see it in two different ways. One is, I think, and this is a pretty reductionist way to look at it, but there's a camp there that just thinks partnering with the private sector is the way to go, that the innovation, the jobs, the money, and the technology that the private sector will unlock will somehow lead to a greater solution. And then there's probably more in line with the way probably we look at it, is that's all well and good, but a lot of the problems are going to be caused by the private sector unless there's an aggressive and clear-eyed attempt to look at what the problems are and either regulate or create expectations that deal with that. I mean, for example, if you look at issues related to income inequality or climate or how workers are treated or the right to water or countless other things that are encompassed in those goals, those aren't going to be achieved unless companies are required to act responsibly, because they are going to be the providers of many of those services, or at least provide some of the economic engines for it. So I feel like it isn't a well thought out debate yet what that means. I think governments reflexively look to the private sector for certain things without thinking through the reality of what it actually is going to require to achieve those goals. And one of the things it's almost certainly going to require is taking a much firmer line with certain types of industries and practices and companies.
Or impacts in terms of corporate behavior. I think like transnational corporations are only like mentioned once in the documents, in the 12th goal around consumer sustainability, et cetera. And there's one target that encourages companies to adopt sustainable practices. So clearly that's not enough. And I think it's accurate to say you have governments financing the kind of gap between what's currently being spent and what would be implied by this kind of massive agenda. You certainly have aid, like we heard the USAID in the last panel, the DFID. There are a lot of international donors, And then the third would be that private sector. It could be social investment. And how do you look at that? And part of it has to do with, when we have not been involved in the negotiations, but just looking at the document, which is incredibly aspirational, even though there are specific targets, but they're general. And I mean, I think it's clear that a lot of work still needs to be done for the implementation. But I was thinking, just based on what we know by interacting with companies on a daily basis, lots of engagements, almost all sectors, trying to move the needle, that the implication for the goals to be arrived at by 2030 would mean a fundamental change of many business models in order to attain any or all of the goals. So on the one hand, it's written all the way through, and then the question is, we know how hard it is to change business models. Sometimes a business model is a human rights violation if it's based on such low wages and maybe slave labor in certain sectors, known or unknown, by the company. And also the huge consumerism issue and the energy utilized. So if you look at all those different pieces, what the sustainable development goals look like to me in our work would really be a conversation about transforming, business models, which are so hard. For years, we engaged, along with a broad coalition, Nike practices, and starting in '95 and continuing. But for a long time, we really looked at the Nike business model, which, certainly the jobs were outsourced. And if you looked at footwear factories, as we did in Indonesia, in China, and in Vietnam in '98, there was something radically wrong with the business model that had kind of a pyramid in, here's the plant in Serang, Indonesia. 100% of the factory was Nike production. Korean owned. So you had Nike production manager who was the sort of the top decision maker, and in his early 30s, former athlete, no sensitivity about the culture, and then you had middle management, you had Koreans, and then middle management were Indonesians, and then probably 90% young women from different parts of Indonesia working. And you really saw that there were so many layers. There were cultural, there was the business model itself, there was this dependence really on this kind of, always available churn of maybe 5 or 6 years of young women coming from different parts of Indonesia to maintain that enterprise. And while the company has made some environmental changes and also has done more on I would say, on the human rights side, if you examine the system that's still in place, it's very much there. So when you look at the goals, and there isn't a kind of sense that there was a real discernment that really looked at the role, of business, the anticipation of perhaps money, investment. Certainly, I think traditionally it's usually been seen that, companies that contribute, jobs, creating jobs, although sometimes that's not the case. Paying taxes, although sometimes they're hidden in different places, and innovation. But I think the sustainable focus is such a challenge. I mean, it's not just the companies, it's the organizations like ours to rethink how we relate to the fundamental questions and connect more carefully, I think, and more intentionally to communities where that's where the impacts are happening. So I really, on one level, love the Sustainable Development Goals because it sets such a high bar. They're more inclusive than the Millennium Development Goals. And they got passed at a time when Pope Francis was in New York, and all of us were, we just kind of were rededicating ourselves to a new way of tackling these interrelated problems of climate change and justice, et cetera. But we've got to figure out a plan. And maybe one thing that we'd like to support would be like a framework for responsible business standards to be plugged into the Sustainable Development Goals, because that would raise the conversation, particularly if that conversation is centered in groups that are working in communities.
I guess for me with the SDGs, an overarching question, I wasn't part of the process, and I know that there were many civil society organizations that were, but the impression I'm left with is that the partner that states see in implementing these is not the impacted communities, but in fact the private sector. And that to me is deeply concerning. Not only from the concern of corporate capture on the one side, to know what role did corporations really have in shaping this process or others that occur at the international level or at the national level when it comes to standard setting, but how are they going to play out? And whether states are going to be looking for the private sector to fulfill some of the obligations that states themselves have. One of the areas of where I've been doing some litigation is the privatization of military and security forces. And when you look at what has happened in the last 15 years, it's now that long, almost since 9/11 happened, and we've been engaged in the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, we have seen such a tremendous outsourcing, first and foremost, of military functions. I'm litigating against a private military contractor that was implicated in torture at Abu Ghraib, implicated by former U.S. Military when they did investigations into the torture at Abu Ghraib. We had also brought cases against Blackwater, who were providing private security services in Iraq. But that is the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the outsourcing of kind of core governmental functions. We see it now throughout the US government. So whether it's the intelligence analysis deciding where we go to war next, or even what are some of our foreign development priorities are, you have a corporate interest that is influencing that in a way that really takes away the voice of those on the ground who will be impacted by these policies to a great level. That's very, very concerning. So I mean, that's one comment that I just am concerned that we're going to further entrench privatization of what should be core governmental functions, as we've seen not only in the war context, but certainly in the schools, in the prisons, and elsewhere. And then the other concern, the big concern, is what does this mean for the voice of impacted communities? Will they really be shaping what happens over the next 15 years in achieving what are they're no longer here, the ambitious SDGs that we talked about in the prior panel. So those would be some of my initial comments.
Excellent, thank you. Go.
One other quick comment. You mentioned Pope Francis, and I think, with all of the everything that's happening, it was very encouraging on the one hand to hear all of the very strong words about climate change. I think I was left very disappointed that the Vatican is not divested from fossil fuels. And I think that is something that it's amazing it wasn't covered much. And when we're looking at the gap between rhetoric and action, we actually have to go there too. We have to hold to the extent people are pointing to that visit, we have to recognize it. But I think first and foremost with our states that are giving a lot of strong reference to human rights in the SDGs. Are we going to see the action? Is it going to be a lot of rhetoric, or is it going to be action?
In the church.
We didn't hear that.
We didn't hear that. Yeah.
It's interesting. So I think when we're looking at private sector actors, I mean, there's a spectrum of private sector actors with how much they are engaging, how positive a role they are having versus the very egregious actions that many are taking at the far end. You brought up Nike in Indonesia, and especially back in the late 90s. You left out the use of off-duty police and military and the Premen, the local mafia, in coercing workers and stifling any dissent. That was an accepted practice at least the local
That's
Nike,
right.
and from most of the evidence, fully aware back at Nike headquarters. Nike headquarters was fully aware of what was going on as well. So you've got, at that one end, you've got obvious accountability concerns and things that need to be addressed. At the other end, we have corporate actors and other private sector actors who do want to do good. I'm correct? Everyone, are you not, everyone agree? Okay.
Yeah.
I was waiting for someone to step out and say that those didn't exist.
Well, I'm not going to say they don't exist, but I think we do have to recognize that the corporate structure, the design of it is not necessarily that we're going to do good. It's to return a profit for shareholders, and that is who a corporation is accountable to. It's not necessarily going to be accountable to the local community where it's working, depending on, in large part, why it's somewhere. You know, if you're doing a mine in Peru and the local community does not want you there, or the local community does not want the natural resource you are extracting to immediately be removed from your country, instead of engaging in a way that might yield a greater all-around development and positive impact on your own community. You know, there's a reason for that, and that's because the corporate structure, again, has profit motive as its primary purpose. And I'm not saying that it to be, you know, cynical or negative, but that is the reality.
Well, I mean, I think for me, the way I would look at it is, does whatever the business activity is, does it actually meet the goal, right? So, I mean, there's some egregious examples. Take the highest attainable level of health. I mean, clearly the SDGs envision a point where the poor have reasonable access to health and things like that. The logical extension of that is that, like what happened 2 weeks ago, a startup drug company shouldn't be able to buy a patent and raise the price of an essential drug 5,000% overnight. And the problem with that is it's completely legal, right? So the question then for a government or the public or anyone else is, okay, if you signed on to achieve the highest attainable standard of health for everyone and it shouldn't disadvantage the poor, then why is this still legal, right? Why is this permitted? Aren't you going to have to address these kinds of situations that clearly disadvantage not just the poor, but particularly the poor? Or in another case, you know, look at other UN bodies, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. If you're saying that the SDGs encompass climate, then you also have to read those reports that are telling you that if you take any more oil out of the ground, you will not achieve that goal, right? So will there be an actual test of the SDGs by governments and others to say, okay, if this business is partnering with us, are they actually doing the things that advance those goals? Now, in some cases, it may be clear and unambiguous that yes, this, you know, whether it may be some product or service that clearly advances that. But then it may be more of a gray area. And I think part of the role of the standards we talk about, whether it's the UN Guiding Principles, the SDGs or others, is to provide that test to say, okay, if you're going to do this, you need to do it differently. And then there are going to be companies that either need to be heavily regulated or just regulated out of business because they can't possibly meet that goal given what they do and how they make their money. Right?
Maybe a little different perspective from sort of active engagement of companies over 20 years. I see, I mean, let's put it in context. It's not a lot of companies. If you have 80,000 sort of, you know, multinational companies, you have 7,000 that are signatories to the UN Global Compact, which really means they've joined a learning center. There's not a real accountability structure. You might have to leave the UN Global Compact if you don't report yearly on what you're doing on the 10 principles, which include human rights, labor rights, environment, and corruption. But then you have probably, through maybe 400 or so companies have real, genuine human rights, comprehensive human rights policies. So that, we're talking about a small universe. But I've seen over my 20 years, my first meeting in '94, when I joined the staff of ICCR as a program director, was with Walmart, and it was dealing with diversity issues. And then we engaged on all the supply chain issues, huge supply. And this was, they hadn't grown totally, but we were dealing with a company that was expanding really rapidly. And it had this kind of Bentonville, Arkansas cultural mentality, and yet was operating all over the world. And so if you fast forward now, there's still issues with the business model, right? Because you're really sort of focusing on one stakeholder. Well, there are actually two, but the one, the customer, that you have to have that low price every day. But you have people within the company now who have been a part of a broader global society and are trying to move the needle on sustainable agriculture, et cetera. Still a long ways to go, but doing much more local sourcing, joining the Coalition of Immokalee Workers Fair Food Program, which has helped to expand that to not just tomatoes in Florida, but to other products, and then up the coast. So they're all the way up to New Jersey already.
Can I ask David a question?
Yeah, sure.
But are they doing that because consumers demanded it, workers demanded it, or because they thought it was the right thing to do? I mean, where was the push coming, or was it all?
It's a mixture. I think more the decision, around the coalition, it's the right thing to do. That's hard to really quantify. But I think we've seen over time, even the difference between David Glass, who was the CEO in '94, and Doug McMillan, who's no progressive, but he's lived in the world that you and I have lived in. And, I would say that for the most part, they're driven by a range of things, and the pressure. Also, it's a company that really has gotten so much, in terms of their labor record, internally. A lot of their issues in the supply chain have gotten a lot of criticism. So you can't say that it's been, a success story, right? But I do think that I can see people in the organization now who have come out of like a development background, who actually, when we're tackling the seafood issue in Thailand and their major supplier, CP Foods, they're really working along with us with Anti-Slavery International, Human Rights Watch, and Project Asara in Thailand to really look at the supply chain, right? So in a way, it matters, why, but if they're really getting on the road of actually trying to make a change for workers that are coming into that supply chain, I think that's the good. But I do think there's also broader sort of change in expectations about what companies need to do to get social license to operate. And that's kind of a vague term, but to me, that's the place where communities really come in. That, if Newmont Mining comes to Peru and wants to expand, and the community says no, you have like $5 billion just sitting as a loss to that company because they didn't get social license. And we had a delegation there in about a year and a half ago to meet with Newmont, to meet with the government, to meet with NGOs in the community, and with the priest who had led kind of the demonstrations against the company. And it was really clear that they'd gotten governmental permission to the expansion. So Newmont has some good people in it, but I think the decision then ends up really looking at it in terms of the social expectations that have changed and need to get put not just in place anecdotally or in this sector or that, but in some kind of broader framework of accountability.
Arvind, Katie, do you want to respond? If not, this leads us to that last question, the one we started with. I mean, is it time for the global community really to contemplate a legally binding convention to address this, to address the issues of accountability?
Well, I mean, the short answer is yes. Okay. And then the real answer is it's going to take a while, right? So, I mean, there is already a treaty discussion taking place and a process in place to do that. But politically, I mean, there are a number of steps that probably have to happen beforehand. One is, I mean, the most basic one is what can you actually regulate right now at the international level, substantively? What does that actually look like? Which is a discussion worth having. And then the second one is the political issue, which is if no single state has yet to regulate this, is it really politically feasible in the short term to expect the UN to be the first place where this gets regulated? And the answer is no. I mean, that's just not what history shows. So for civil society and others, I think it's kind of a two-tiered approach. One is you want regulation, and you want norms, and you want rules. That's important because it'll codify what a lot of things are. So, but you also politically have to create the environment for where that can happen. And that's going to require a lot of work by a lot of people, both to codify what does a treaty look like, but also work at the national and other levels to make sure regulations and other things are constantly coming up that could be part of that. And we're already seeing that. I mean, if you look at like what David mentioned, the anti-trafficking, anti-slavery laws that are showing up at the state level in California, nationally, and in various pieces of legislation, that's one element. All the disclosure laws around the oil, gas, and mining industry in the US, in Canada, in the EU, that's all happening too. All the conflict minerals stuff is happening. That's all new. That means that we're actually seeing regulations come into place in a way that never happened before. At the same time, every key parts of industry are contesting it every step of the way, whether it's through the courts in the case of Dodd-Frank, 1502 and 1504, or whether it's through lobbying in Europe or elsewhere. This is reality. So I don't think anybody is naive about how difficult it is, but it's also true that it's happening, right? So even though the American Petroleum Institute fought tooth and nail to prevent a disclosure law in the US, well, what happened? I mean, through successive court cases, they've had to do it. And two, while they were fighting it in the US, it was proliferating around the world. So it's clear that some, things are changing. It's just going to be pretty hard fought. And so yes, there will need to be global norms because the problems we have today don't really lend themselves to just national regulation. But it's going to take time, and it's also going to take probably very thoughtful and smart kind of articulation of what standards look like by civil society more than anyone else.
Maybe I'll jump on next. And as probably, or maybe not everyone in the audience knows, there is an open-ended working group on putting forward a potentially legally binding instrument on business and human rights that had its first meeting in July in Geneva at the UN. And I was there in my dual FIDH-CCR capacity. And what was a few comments on just how we got there. First of all, is that there was really a huge push from civil society in the Global South for this treaty. There had been a meeting in Bangkok 2 years ago with literally hundreds of NGOs putting their name on and saying, we need legally binding standards. We had Pillar 3, right to remedy, and we're not seeing it given effect. We're not seeing states adopt, to the extent that there are gaps, clear laws that bind companies for their operations, not only at home, but extraterritorially. And in the United States, that's where we saw, through a court decision, a rollback in 2013. And we've been fighting that now in the courts for the last 2 years to be able to hold US multinationals, if not foreign multinationals, liable for what they do outside the US. But so you had this Global South movement making a demand, which brought us to the meeting in July. And I was one of very few NGOs who were there from either North America or Europe. It was primarily civil society from the Global South. As Arvind said, you also need political buy-in. And unfortunately, you did not have the EU or the US there either. So maybe that's a good thing, at least to some extent, but it also raises serious concerns about whether or not this process is going to go forward in a way that a viable product will come out in the end. So I think there's a lot of work that's being done right now in the Global South with capitals, as well as particularly in Europe, to try and get more buy-in to this process. Regardless of whether or not we end up with a treaty on regulating business and human rights, and of course, what does that mean? Is it a treaty that states sign that then require them to implement legislation to hold companies accountable for their extraterritorial activities? I think that's sort of where we're at now anyway, with the guiding principles. So maybe it can happen through the national action plans that were supposed to be adopted through the Ruggie process. Whether it's the treaty implementing national action plans or just getting stronger implementation and then enforcement of existing law, I think the treaty process has fired people up, and I hope is waking companies up that they have to take really this whole movement much more seriously. And again, not just give lip service, but truly engage with the impacted communities before they go in and, you know, open a huge mine, or when they're going to set up a factory. Engage with the local community to ensure that the labor standards are met, or at least, you know, far better than we're seeing in places like with the Rana Plaza horror. So I think we're in a moment right now where the corporate accountability, corporate business and human rights community is very, very engaged. And there are meetings going on at this point globally. And again, focus is much more in the South than it is in Europe and the US to really come up with some strategies to hold corporations accountable.
Do you have something?
Just one quick, you know, I think because we work with companies all the time, we're always looking for, you know, the tools, the incident, the relationship with groups on the ground to, you know, to either, you know, make the case and move the policies into implementation. To some degree, you know, the UN guiding principles on business human rights, I mean, you know, they're helpful but not sufficient. They're helpful, I mean, I think of, you know, like 2002 where ICCR organized, it was a dialogue with ExxonMobil, and it was on human rights. And I think this was the first time we were joined with Amnesty USA, who had purchased some shares in a number of companies just to engage. But you had the public pension funds as well as faith-based investors. And my job was to introduce the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to the company and pass it across the table. And I just, they wanted to pass it back because there was no reason that should happen. I mean, go to the government. The government has the role of protecting human rights. That doesn't happen as much anymore because of the framework of, you know, states' duty to protect, corporate responsibility to respect. But if that respect includes a really serious that human rights due diligence of assessing what the impacts are, and us coming in and saying, you're not going to, ExxonMobil or whatever company, you're not going to be able to do that through your own process and find where the negative impacts are. You need to, a companion community-based impact assessment that Oxfam has done. It started with Rights and Democracy in Canada some years ago, which really helped to sort of, who better to identify risks of impacts in communities than the community themselves. So it set terms of the debate that, while it didn't go far enough, has the capacity then to, the discussion can't just be shifted off. And so what is the corporate responsibility respect? If you really seriously do an assessment and then integrate the findings, and then you're assessing it and really reporting publicly. And that's why we've been supportive of organizing investors recently to sign on to a statement in strong support of the U.S. In the Congress, in the Senate and the House. It's basically a bill for reporting around, supply chain trafficking and slavery issues, much like the California law, but has greater teeth and would report to the SEC, not just put, the report on your website. But I think it's just not sufficient. But I think almost for us, for our organization, it's, if we're doing our work in tandem and in coalition with a range of other organizations that are leading towards greater accountability, I think that's going to be huge. And to me, it's always been, in terms of our work, we've never made significant progress without, like, Rana Plaza, which, as sad as that is to say, to really then get companies to adopt a binding agreement, the Accord for the fire and building safety, to work on that issue for at least 5 years, and set up worker management committees, et cetera. So I think we really have, with the Sustainable Development Goals, I just see the need for, multi-layer coalitions all over the place, but to hopefully come to, awareness that from the political perspective, that there's a multi-stakeholder way to go forward. I mean, it certainly helped on when the SEC was writing the rules for the conflict minerals reporting, to have some companies there as well with, investors, trade unions, NGOs, to say these are the types of rules that really need to be there to make the reporting significant. So I hope, that whatever we're each doing can find a way, a very tangible way, to develop that kind of framework.
Yeah, in thinking about a sustainable company, I think what it all comes back down to is, in various different ways, I think we're all saying the same thing, is to actually start that conversation, you first have to show that you're not doing any harm, right? And if you are doing harm, you have to be accountable for it. So whether it's doing adequate due diligence or working with local communities or getting their buy-in for certain projects, those are the minimum steps, those are the kinds of steps you have to take to show that you have the potential to be a productive and beneficial actor, both locally and internationally. But if something goes wrong, and just the nature of systems are, things go wrong, you've got to be accountable for it if it's pretty egregious as well. Mm-hmm. And that probably is the building block for being a sustainable company, because if you can't do that, then any benefits you create are kind of offset by these things. And in a way that encapsulates where this whole debate is, whether it's on the treaty or anything today, in that I would say that all of us for the last 15 years have been pushing very hard to get institutions to understand they can't do that harm. And now that that's been realized to a great degree, we're now pushing to show what it means to be held accountable for doing harm, right? Mm-hmm. So it's kind of the evolution of this whole approach.
final comment?
Yeah, I just, I've been saying the words community and rights. We've all been saying community and rights. And as much as we're talking kind of about baseline, I also, of course, want to flag that these are deep terms, community and rights. So when we're saying that get buy-in of the local community, that is not a monolithic community. No. And you need to be very aware of the particular needs of those on the margins, whether it's women, whether it's indigenous communities, the political power, and how that manifests itself, the cultural differences. So it's also, as outsiders in the human rights community, certainly for companies, I think we have to also ensure that they're building in and that all voices in the local community are being heard in this process of due diligence and mutual engagement. And the other aspect is on rights. We talk a lot about labor rights. I think there's been a growing recognition of environmental rights, but there are a range of rights. Right. I mentioned our first case involving sexual violence and mass rapes. Really, you can go down the line of economic, social, cultural, civil, political rights, and community corporations are implicated in respecting, and I'd say protecting, all of those rights. So I think we also need ourselves, and again, with the communities and the corporations, to be thinking very, very holistically and not look at slices of rights or community.
Excellent, thank you. And in the spirit of community engagement, I think we're going to open up for questions right now, unless no one has questions. We'll take a few questions. Do you want to grab the mic? Thanks, Bob.
I'm here from the University of Dayton. Both in this panel and the previous one, we heard about some of the concerns about privatization and of both basic human needs and also of development aid. One of the things I worry about a little bit is the free trade agreements that are coming up and how whether these have the potential to undermine a lot of both the SDGs and environmental policies. As a quick example, do no harm is a good principle that maybe corporations are starting to pay attention to, but in the case of fossil fuels, if we aren't allowed to dig them out of the ground anymore, then there are going to be a lot of both state actors and corporations who are going to say, okay, you're taking away my ability to do my business. And so and then if they can begin to bring these cases to courts that are supra-UN, I think there are a lot of concerns to think about there.
Richard.
Thanks, Rich Hiskus from Grand Valley. First of all, thank you all for a really interesting and engaged discussion. I guess my question is sort of for Arvind, but it's really for all of you. You had a consistent theme in your comments that it's civil society that is where the action is and where we can look for hope. And as an educator, that's optimistic for me because I can have some role there in educating young people. It's really good news for Mark and Sulaco because it might lead him to fulfill his lifelong goal of bringing Bono and U2 to Dayton. But I guess I wonder how cynical or skeptical you are about government on this regard, because Jimmy Carter came to my university last fall and we had a couple conversations, and he was very clear. He said, anything I've ever accomplished in human rights was after I was president. And this is the president who introduced the concept of human rights to American foreign policy. And he just said, I've completely given up on government. Government can't do a thing that's really going to make a difference in the world of human rights. So tell your students, don't ask me, go out and work in civil society to make things. And in some ways that was heartening, and it was something that was invigorating, but also was kind of sad that the leader, the most powerful person in the world, said, forget about government when it comes to realizing human rights. So I guess that'd be my question.
Can we take one more question?
How you doing? I'm Dom Sanfilippo. I'm a senior, human rights senior here. To bounce off of that sort of, I guess, another fold of that question, a lot of people have talked throughout the morning, especially you all touched on the fact that there seems to be this gap between conceptualizing the sort of the abuses and the problems that senior figures, whether they be politicians or CEOs, can do, the gap between that and bringing them sort of into a court or under some case, whether it be Center for Constitutional Rights calling out for maybe we should talk about war crimes or prosecuting for that, or I think there was finally a CEO, the one who a few people died after, which food company was it this year, where there was finally a case filed against the CEO. Was it Salmonella?
Salmonella.
Yeah, the peanut one, and that sent shockwaves across the internet and like within, I think, college students, because here's finally an example of somebody crossing that bridge. But how do we get to the point in like my next college generation where it's not this intense partisan battle to start talking about people like politicians and corporate figures are accountable in a court of law, and that's not a horrible thing, because I think I'm a human rights student. Many of my best friends are business students, and they would say, "Oh, well, you just want to shut down businesses, you want to arrest everybody else." That's not what it is. It has to be some healthy middle ground that we eventually can get to. So I guess my question for you would be, what do we have to do? What does my generation have to do to get to a healthy ground where we can say people can be held accountable and we can still keep things functioning? Because we're in the zone where there seems like there's little to no space for people to be prosecuted and for change to happen.
Thank you. Whichever one.
Yeah, I think to the first question, yeah, trade agreements are central to this, whether it's labor rights protections or investor-state disputes or others. And I mean, just the other day, the Obama administration floated this idea that the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, would not allow, for example, tobacco companies to use investor-state dispute mechanisms to undermine public health rules, right, because of what's happened in Australia and elsewhere. So that isn't because the Obama administration decided a year or two ago that was something they needed to do. It was because a lot of people spoke out about how ridiculous it was for subsidiaries of Philip Morris and others to sue Australia in an international arbitration panel over public health labeling, essentially. So I mean, this kind of goes to the second and third points, which is I don't think government is hopeless. I just look at how things have changed in this space over the last 100 years or so. If you go back to the Gilded Age in the United States, what actually led to antitrust law? It was people like Ida Tarbell writing about what Standard Oil was doing in Maclean's magazine. What led to the FDA was Upton Sinclair writing about what was happening in the meatpacking industry in Chicago and elsewhere. So if you look at environmental law, it's the same thing. It was environmentalists pointing out what was happening with pollution in various places, Love Canal and other places, right? And if you look at anti-corruption movements, it's the same thing. So my view is that government is always the last actor to act. The first actor are the ones that will point out that there's a problem. And in today's world, it's civil society, less so than maybe the press was or other types of activists were 50 or 100 years ago, for a variety of reasons. So I don't see it as government being useless. I just don't think government is the first actor to move. It's the last actor to move. And I think the problem you run into with human rights work, and I learned this at Human Rights Watch, and this is probably one of the few reasons why I'm glad I'm not a lawyer, is I got to Human Rights Watch and everybody says you can't report on it unless it's international law. And my attitude always was, well, the law doesn't exist until you find the problem, right? So with business and human rights, we're kind of at that moment in the same way we were with landmines or cluster munitions or migrant workers or domestic workers 5, 10, 15 years ago. What civil society does better than any other type of institution is identify the problem that needs to be solved and then create the political environment for which it can be solved. And then what you see, especially in business and human rights, is after that starts happening, the private sector will slowly get engaged in certain ways, and then eventually the government will. So it's not the government's useless, although, I mean, there's been a huge amount of regulatory capture over the last 20 years, and there's no doubt about that. It's just that nobody should rely on them as the first mover. And to the last point, I mean, part of what changes companies or governments are the people in them, right? So there's no standard we can propose that's going to go anywhere unless there are people in companies pushing for the same thing. And so, I mean, and this may be overly optimistic, I know that's generational too. So whoever is in college thinking about this today is going to be the person of one of these three institutions 10 years from now, right? So that's going to change things as well. And I think that that does play a role. I mean, when we did the Enron report in 1999, when we've done work on BP, when we've done work on even internet companies in the last few years, one thing will always come out, and I'm sure David has heard this, and I'm sure you've heard this, is part of the reason some companies want to change is because they are getting internal pushback from their own employees that they don't want to show up at a company that does these kinds of things.
Totally.
So there are multiple ways to influence the way, you know, companies or governments act. The thing that I always try to remember is companies are not amoral or unethical or anything. They're just institutions that are set up to do a certain thing. The way they do that are rules set by society as a whole, right? And that's where the influence is at the end of the day. Katie?
Yeah, just on maybe the last question, I think when I started, I said that at CCR we bring lawsuits, but usually it's in service of a movement. And our lawsuits can only be as successful to some extent as the movement behind us. I think we actually do have a lot of laws. When we file lawsuits, we're not citing aspirational laws. We're citing laws that are there. This litigation is just extremely contentious. It's usually a small number of plaintiff lawyers against massive corporate firms who invoke, as is their right, I guess, every single defense they can, which is why our cases tend to go on for 13 years or 11 years, or my Abu Ghraib contractor cases, we've been litigating those for 14 years. One loss, one settlement, and the last case is still going on. That is exhausting for our plaintiffs. That can be a little tiring for the lawyers, and it's often very tiring for the movement, because the movement may have started around an issue, and over the course of a lawsuit, they've moved on, and the issue has sort of moved on, or maybe in some cases it hasn't. But I think to have that kind of success and to make the company come to a point where they realize they shouldn't be fighting anymore. And if we're not getting a judge to say that, and often we do, and then we're up and down between district courts, federal courts, Supreme Court, and back again, it's because they're hearing it from consumers. It's because they're hearing it from the street. So I think there is plenty to do as just a member of society. And this is part of why I asked you that question of why the company changed. Was it consumers? Was it, you know, the negative press? We all have a role. And I'm no more or no less as a lawyer pushing these cases than anyone else in this room. And the ability, I think, to kind of shift the way corporations behave and the way we hold our governments accountable too, for how much leeway they allow corporations.
David? Well, I think character, matters a lot from, in terms of just the, we have to look at the institutional structures, and especially when we're looking at all the issues related to the 17 goals. And we also have to look at the incredible courage and character that a lot of people have at stake in building a more sustainable future. And it ain't a slogan. It really has to do with their own health, their own kids' health. I'm just thinking right now of, it's a small little community in Louisiana, Mossville. It's a traditional sort of African-American community founded in the 1790s. And, but you fast forward, 14 petrochemical plants surround Mossville. So we've worked with activists from the community that formed about 10 years ago the Mossville Environmental Action Now, MEAN. And they're just an amazing group with a lot of courage because they've been raising issues about land, you know, from the human rights perspective, water from the human rights perspective, air from the health human rights perspective, you know, 5 times the dioxin level in the air in that area. And so we found that we own shares in a number of those companies, ConocoPhillips, Georgia Pacific, Statoil, and each one thought they were doing fine because they had their community advisory groups. But we found that none of the community leaders were on those groups. And it wasn't until we organized like a roundtable on the human right to water, which brought about 20 companies and about, 15 community leaders on water issues from different parts of the world to have a conversation about, you know, where do we go? And it was really there that this one person from Georgia Pacific, you know, literally did not know what was taking place. And he was sitting next to the couple that had come from MEAN, and it was like, you know, the Human Right to Water roundtable ended. They were still there. This was a day when New York was deluged with snow. Everybody was trying to scurry to get out. They literally talked for 4 or 5 hours. And that sort of interaction, you know, helped to spur the action of part of Georgia Pacific, changing its, you know, so it no longer was a part of the consensus, then ConocoPhillips. But, you know, it took all of that organizing by MEAN to get the EPA to come in. And that wasn't enough, so they filed a complaint with the Inter-American Human Rights Commission, and that was filed several years ago. So all of this moved forward, but I think the ability for that kind of interchange to take place, change can happen, but we can't give up on governments. I mean, you know, that is a tough nut, but I'm just thinking of what President Obama did in 2012, signed this executive order requiring all government contractors to report and put in place compliance plans on what they're doing around slavery and trafficking in their extended supply chain, not just their primary suppliers. And that came into effect March 2nd through the Federal Acquisition Registry rules. That's all of a sudden, we found in our dialogues with companies that had resisted looking at that lens, really saying, okay, what do we do? Because in order to get a contract going forward, they would have to put in place a plan that looked at their high-risk areas in terms of modern slavery and put in place plans where they found issues that they remediated. Now, you can do that as a paper checklist kind of thing, which we can't allow to happen, but that sort of scales, you know, a regulation or a law scales the work in such a way that I think companies that have been doing the right thing, in some areas at least, you know, will be able to help and lead their sectors, and others are just going to have to, you know, move in that direction. So, you know, I think we just have to keep working on so many different layers and levels, but part of it also is that kind of face-to-face sort of interaction with civil society, with community leaders. Granted, you know, so many of our human rights impact assessments that I've seen companies do, you know, are more try to sell the product, and it's the free, prior, and informed consent ain't there. No. So the consent is so absolutely critical. But I think it's a mosaic of amazing groups that are working in various institutions that can help, you know, build a framework that can maybe nudge forward the Sustainable Development Goals in such a way that it's not the Millennium Development Goals again, but rather some real change.
Excellent. We have time for 1 or 2 more. Thanks, Yusuf.
Hi, thank you. Michael Goodhart, University of Pittsburgh. I appreciate all your comments. So color me skeptical, however, because it seems to me like corporate social responsibility assumes what it ought to demonstrate. That is, that corporations are capable of being responsible actors in a way that would actually allow us to achieve a world in which human rights were realized. Let me give you an analogy. You can suspend every cop who inappropriately shoots an unarmed black person, but you're not going to change the structural racism that infests police forces by doing that. There's a deeper structural problem about the fundamental mentality. Similarly, you can encourage the good people in corporations, and I'm not denying that there are some, to behave better on this issue or that issue, or to take this or that, obligation seriously. And even if they all did that, you wouldn't be addressing the underlying structures of corporate power that have created a world in which the exploitation of the earth and its resources and its people for profit is accepted as business as usual, something that has to be partnered with, something that has to be accommodated, something that's an essential piece of the work that has to be done. So I appreciate what you're saying. I don't doubt for a moment the sincerity of any of you, but I just think it's fundamentally inadequate to the task we face. We used to talk about malefactors of great wealth. Now we talk about corporate partners. I mean, something has fundamentally shifted, and if we don't address that, we're not going to get anywhere.
Right. Excellent. Can we take one more question?
No disagreement.
On this side. We haven't had anyone on this side of the room yet. I want you to get your exercise today.
Thank you very much, and thank you really for the panel. But I will also express a little bit of skepticism. I think, David, you said that, my friend Jörg Kell, the secretary of the Global Compact, said the same thing, that after all this struggle, only about 1% of the corporations are really committed. Yeah. And he said if we stretch it, we can get up to 10% of who will sign it. And the other 99, between 90 and 99% are out of this spectrum. So one issue really is that the problem is much bigger than what the corporate responsibility movement would do. Mm-hmm. But the second issue is that the governments, and Arvind, I really liked your answer, but and the way in which you structured it, but the governments in a globalized world do not really have the power, because their interest has now become synonymous with the interest of their own corporations. And so protecting your own corporations and projecting them becomes a part of your public concern. And so when you refer to the Gilded Age, and we are now back in the Gilded Age, when you refer to the Gilded Age, it was actually states working in cahoots with their businessmen. And you required Teddy Roosevelt and the federal government to come in and try to protect the public interest. We do require the same kind of international system, except we don't have it. Mm-hmm. It's like we are back in the Gilded Age, and the states are in cahoot with the business, and they're the only ones who have the power. Mm-hmm. And how do you see us moving forward in a situation like this? I think, relying entirely on corporate responsibility and the goodwill of a few people, perhaps 1% of the entire population of that occupy it, is perhaps too optimistic, too ambitious.
Well, I mean, my take on it is a little bit different. So the reason only 1% of companies have done anything is because there isn't anything really pushing all companies to do something. And the problem, I mean, you're right. In a Gilded Age, you could regulate nationally, and that made it different. Where I would disagree with you is I don't actually think governments can't regulate. I think they won't regulate, and a large reason for that is because of regulatory capture by industry. And the most obvious example of that in this country is when the Supreme Court equates money with free speech or something like that, right? So I would set aside the notion that governments can't regulate. They absolutely can. If a government wants to regulate something, it will. And that's what a free trade agreement is. That's what anything else is. What is different today is that in a globalized economy, traditional forms of regulation do not work. And what you need instead are multi-layered regulations. So you need, at the national level or the local level, hopefully governments doing their job. At the extraterritorial level, you need home governments like the US or the EU doing their job. But even absent that, you need shareholders, litigation, and other outside pressures to quasi-regulate them. So lending agreements, trade agreements, the expectations of, say, the Norwegian oil fund on companies, all of these have a regulatory effect, right? Because we're in a world where the traditional model of a single government passing rules or regulations to regulate an industry domestically doesn't work. And instead, what you need are much more layered approaches to it. So a company should no longer just worry about a regulation in its home country. It might worry about changes in the countries it operates in. It may worry about shareholder expectations because money will change. Ideally, what would happen is that for companies that perform badly on these things, there would be both regulation and accountability, but also the cost of money would increase. And that's probably going to happen with things that are climate intensive, right? So the cost of an oil company getting a loan is probably going to go up over the next few years because it's a problem for the lender. And so in a globalized world, you just need to see this on multiple levels. My view on companies or anything else is, I mean, I will be a little bit contrarian. I don't really care about the bigger picture because I can't solve that problem. What I do know is that if an institution that wants to do the wrong thing is prohibited from doing it, or a series of institutions is, maybe some will still do it, but at least they'll be held accountable for it, right? And the way I equate it to is criminal law or the 10 Commandments. I mean, murder has been prohibited since the beginning of time, and people still murder. So you can't stop people or institutions from doing the wrong thing. What you can do is create consequences for those that are caught or do it. And right now, there are just not enough consequences to stop some of these behaviors. And if there are, a lot of them would probably stop overnight. And that's just the reality. So I share some of your concerns, but I feel at a certain level, some of these are problems that can't easily be solved as well, unless we take a much different approach to how we look at them.
We're at our time, so a brief comment from David and a final word to Katie.
The issue in terms of the, a company, making some changes, but it not really addressing the fundamental systemic issues, I think is absolutely accurate. I mean, when our members sit down with companies, it really isn't so much a corporate responsibility discussion. If you see corporate responsibility in a certain lens of, here's your business, but then you maybe have some social investments, you have some pilot projects doing a variety of things for communities, et cetera. What we're really looking for is a company, a responsible company internalizes the external costs that have been put on society, whether it's social, environmental, or economic. That's the discussion that we have. Now, even that discussion, where does that go? Often it's going against the work of, looking at a company. I mean, look at the CSR reports, for example. No metrics about, what the company's actually doing through its business, the impacts of the business. It's more about, really nice anecdotes of interactions either with women's empowerment program that you might have in Bangladesh, or you might have a program on, access to water in the Philippines. So that's the struggle. That is the absolute struggle, and I think the Sustainable Development Goals raise that question that I don't think we've answered, which is, the role of companies in what is their role and responsibility in the transformed sort of sustainable future that we see, and it has to be one that looks at initially internalizing the external costs, and then to really look at the political influence. So much of our work is trying to get companies to, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, for example, in this country, on health issues that we've worked on, domestic health, global health, on issues of labor and human rights. A lot of companies really have policies that are pretty much in alignment with some of the human rights issues, but hide behind, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce that then lobbies heavily to, really make sure that Congress doesn't address any of this. So I see our work as very reformist in one sense, but also, damn it, if people are invested in that company, we better put these issues there, and we better connect to the movements that are really trying to change it. So there's that kind of responsibility of that stakeholder, and ICCR has a whole coalition of those, some of whom are really putting a lot of money into a very different type of future and not into the global companies. But we have an obligation to really try to change that company, recognizing that it's really, it's one very, very small part of a larger movement that needs to take place.
And very quickly, if you said this is a huge issue. If the 17 points of the SDGs isn't an opportunity to look holistically at the role of corporations and our human rights, I don't know what moment is. And I think it's pretty disheartening to take stock of where we're at. And I think your points are all quite valid, or very valid, fully valid. And I think we all have to pause. And for everyone in this room, again, business and human rights, corporate accountability, corporate responsibility, it is not a niche issue. It is something that transcends and cuts across every aspect of work that people are doing. So it is something that all of us have to really pay attention to, mobilize, and demand change if we're not going to end up with these 17 SDGs all being fully regulated and ruled by corporations by 2030, if not already now. So sorry to end on a pessimistic note.
One thing, and we didn't talk about this much, but to pay attention to, there is one movement that's actually going against a lot of what we talked about, that's actually going against the notion that companies are so entrenched and immovable that governments won't act. And the one to pay attention to is the tax justice movement, particularly in Europe. Because within a very short period of time, the environment has changed pretty dramatically for companies. That movement has not come as strongly to the US for a variety of reasons, and some are obvious. But the tax justice movement says a lot about what people can do, even in the face of going after the one thing you would think companies and even governments hate going after. And they've been very successful. So I would say that,
Please join me in thanking our panel for a wonderful presentation.
Good job. Good job.
Way to end positively.